let's introduce our speakers. Aubrey and Judith. Aubrey is a retired Royal Navy Canadian officer and clearance diving officer, as well as a retired teacher. He's past Commodore of the Toronto Hydroplane and Sailing Club and currently a member of the North Channel Yacht Club on the north shore of Lake Huron, I beg your pardon. He has his skipper's and instructor certificates from the Canadian Yachting Association and the British Keel Yacht Club. After being awarded the prestigious Bayfield Award with the Great Lakes Cruising Club for sailing over 5,000 nautical miles throughout all the Great Lakes, he and his wife Judith have been full-time liveaboards for 20 years on Volata 4, their 1978 Ontario 32, having sailed the east and west coasts of North America, as well as the Med and the North and Black Seas. And Aaron and Patricia Fenton have owned boats from 25 to 37 feet and chartered in the BVI and the Grenadines. Aaron has crewed on deliveries of boats 32 to 55 feet down and up the Atlantic, past Mexico and through the Great Lakes. He currently races on a CNC 33 at the National Yacht Club and also enjoys his cottage sunfish. Please give Aubrey and Aaron and Judith a warm showback welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping that we can get this going. Do I click on here first? And screen share.
Yeah, you're sharing the screen. Yep. Go ahead and bring up the slideshow.
Okay, do you have my picture there?
Click on
Yes, we do.
You're good.
Okay. Now, this is our boat card. We are on Volata 4. We've been living on it for over 20 years. And we have a Hotmail address and also a website. I'll show this card at the end of the session in case any of you wish to copy it down, and we'd be very glad to hear from you. What we are doing today is talking about our go home cruise. And that was we started from El Salvador, and we wanted to bring the boat back to the Great Lakes. Volata has only been back to the Great Lakes once in the last 22 years. So when we were in El Salvador, we decided to ship the boat back to the Great Lakes. Our choice was whether we wanted to go through the Panama Canal and sail all the way up, or to go and ship it. We elected the shipping. And so today we're talking about our trip from El Salvador up to the northern tip of the Sea of Cortez, where we were then going to put the boat on a flatbed truck and then ship it from Puerto Penasco and in Mexico over to Chicago. And then from Chicago, sail it up to Lake Huron and the North Channel Yacht Club, which is our home area. We started out from a place called Bahia del Sol in El Salvador, and we had left our boat there for a couple of seasons because there was a mooring field that is coordinated by an American expat who lives down there. And we found it very economical. What was it? I think $125 a month to be able to leave our boat there for prolonged periods of time. We could live on the boat. In fact, while we were there, we stayed on the boat, and we would often use a dinghy to go all the way up here to Herradura, where we could buy supplies and food and things of that nature. The interesting thing about this was the entrance going into the area, because it was tidal and surging and narrow, and we could only enter at slack water, high tide, and we had to have a guide boat to take us in. This is the kind of surge that you would have going in through that particular opening. And the boats had to navigate around these surges. This is a picture of a boat coming in, and you can see the surge that occurs. This is the local guide who knows the water. He speaks only Spanish. This is Bill, who the expat American, who then serves as a translator, and then by VHF has the boat follow this guide boat in through the surf. And here's the picture he took of Valeda as we were surfing down the surf coming into this port. And we were clipping along probably at 7 or 8 knots when we were riding that surf. This is an interesting picture of a single boat. This picture, the next pictures are taken over a 40-second period as this boat surged through the waves.
Wow.
As you can see the difficulty he had, and his final surge was plunging down into the next one. The boat actually survived, but this was the kind of condition, even in quiet conditions, that occurs in the entrance there. The other interesting thing that we did is that these are all tidal flats, and you have to negotiate it very carefully if you're in any kind of a keel boat. But we would use our dinghies and we would travel around. And over in this area, on the tidal flats, they had a series of palapas, which are basically shelters on stilts. And the local families would come down on the weekends and open it up and have beautiful fish fries. And so this was the kind of situation that we would come to have a lovely fish dinner. And what would happen is that the owners would bring out a big tray with a half dozen different fish that were just caught that morning. And you could then check which fish you wanted, and they would then fix it up for you and then bring it to your table. In the meantime, you were enjoying your friends and having some beer and refreshments. They had a few hammocks slung there. So it was quite an informal but enjoyable kind of situation. The actual palapas were on stilts, and we came into it by dinghy. But what would happen is that as the tide went out, these dinghies would then be up on sand. So we had some kids who would always maneuver the dinghies to keep the dinghies in the water, because at low tide, these palapas were high and dry. And so we had to make sure that the dinghies were in the open water. Even on shore, they had these palapas here that were operational, and they're very good little restaurants. So our first jaunt was to go from Bahia del Sol up to Chiapas. And that was a little over 260 nautical mile run. And we started off from there on February the 2nd, and we made our run, and just about here, we had some major engine problems in the middle of the night, of course, and it was also at the halfway point. And with the engine problems that we had to decide, do we try to go into shelter, or do we try to carry on, or do we go back to El Salvador? Guatemala coast here on the west coast, there are no good anchorages or marinas. There are only a couple of ports for fishing boats. But the problem that we had was that for some reason or other, the alarm did not go off when we lost the alternator belt, and the engine overheated, and there was smoke coming out of the engine, and everything was badly overheated to the extent that our water lock had a hole actually burned into it, and water was hissing out of here. The hose connections coming in here and going out here were all becoming warped. So we had to remove this water block from the whole system, and then we connected the hoses directly so that we no longer had the water block. It created a little bit of a risk, because if we had an overtaking wave, that overtaking wave could possibly put water back into the engine, but we had to accept that risk. We replaced the alternator belts, and so the decision was, are we in problems or shall we continue on? But we did continue on. So we made our landfall at Chiapas. We spent 4 days there cleaning up. Two of our friends that were on board had to leave at that point in time. So it was just Aaron and myself that continued on. And these little X's then marks problem that Aaron and I had. And again, the alternator belts were breaking and a water belt broke. When we were crossing this Gulf of Tehuantepec, we had another break in the water by the alternator belt. And the replacement that we had was the wrong size. And we could not get the proper tension on the actual alternator. So Aaron, could you explain here what our problem was with that bit of an alternator problem?
Thank you, Aubrey. My sound coming through?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, the alternator pivots in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, and it's extended to put tension on the belt by moving out along that arm that you can see in the center of the screen. With the belts that we had, they were large enough that the arm wasn't long enough. To tension the alternator properly, I suspended it with the blue cord that you see up out of the cockpit onto the port winch. And that's how we got enough tension on the alternator to function so that the belts would stay in place. That's a bit of a jerry rig, but it allowed us to continue with the alternator working for the engine. And then we were able to get a smaller belt, which would fit properly. And then the alternator could be secured along that bracket.
So it was a bit of a Rube Goldberg condition, but it actually worked. And we actually had good weather following that as we went across this Gulf of Tehuantepec. When we got into Huatelco, we had it repaired. Here's our mechanic, Miguel. This lady was, I think, from France, but she spoke English and French and Spanish. And so she served as our interpreter. And
that was a big help, Aubrey, because my Spanish is quite limited as yours. And trying to explain something that made sure the mechanico knew what we were asking about was a challenge. But this lady with her fluency really saved the day for us.
Yeah.
The other thing that I found very helpful was, and this is technology, Google comes through. You can tap on your phone, alternator belt, and it'll come up in Spanish, and the fellow knows what you're talking about by going back and forth on your cell phone. So it allowed us to find things of which we did not know.
Yeah, we actually got several extra belts available. And the problem that we found and why we were breaking the belts was that the pulleys from the alternator and the engine were not properly in line.
Yes, well, this is because, I mean, I have to say the normal ship's engineer was not on board at this point, but she's also really not a trained ship's engineer. I just did the best job I could of aligning things, and it wasn't quite good enough.
Yeah. So anyway, that was the source of those difficulties. However, we still had we went then from Huatelco up to Acapulco and went in there to refuel. And then we stopped at Huanahejo and then up to Barra de Navidad. But here we are cruising along on a half decent afternoon. And Aaron had a particularly interesting little device. Aaron, would you explain what this InReach device is? Aaron,
thank you, Aubrey. Okay, then. Yeah, the InReach is a device that combines a number of things. It's obviously an EPIRB, which is helpful for safety. Secondly, it's a GPS. But the real nice thing about it is it allows you to communicate with anybody else by sending them a text message, and all your significant friends and spouses and so on can check a link with InReach and see where you are exactly at what time and what's happening, and send you a text, and vice versa. You can say, we're all fine. I've got a bad sunburn, but I'm okay. And that makes a wonderful communication. Over to you.
Yeah, we found it very handy because we were able to let Judy know how we were progressing. And as we went up the coast, we saw this is the kind of coastal ships. These are large container ships that go up and down the coast. But we had some beautiful weather, so that Aaron and I had this one day we had a lovely lunch at sea, and things seemed to be right with the world at that point in time. As we came up to a place called Barra de Navidad, Aaron was going to have to leave us at that point, and a friend of his, David Weston, also from the National Yacht Club, came down to then accompany me. And we had been in this before. We had left Valletta in the marina here for one season. And this happened to be also an extremely good hurricane hole, because we had some mountains on this side, and up here was a bit of a flat and more mountains. So this whole area, both the marina and this large lagoon in which many boats anchored for long periods of time, were a very good hurricane hole. And so this is just an aerial photograph of that particular location. Again, these are shallows that, for example, keelboat can't go up into this area at all. You can only get up there by dinghy and that. And the anchorage over here is spacious. There are many boats, 20 to 30 boats that would anchor there for prolonged periods of time. And they were organized enough that they had a daily net so that they could talk about what was going on in town. And there was also a VHF contact with the local water taxi that over here. So a water taxi would come out and then bring you back into town, so you didn't have to use your own dinghy. So it's just a nice cruiser community that was established there, including this guy at the French bakery. And he would come around to the marina and go out into the anchorage every morning and sell his baked goods. And we enjoyed his croissants, especially Judy liked the chocolate croissants that he had. What were they?
Yeah, chocolate croissants, a variety of breads and pastries. Very good.
Yeah, and he would actually take an order. If, for example, the next day you wanted a particular bread, he would make sure that it was saved for you, and he would bring it out to your boat. So it was a very nice, pleasant cruising community in that particular area of Barra de Navidad. And the town was used for the Spanish fleet in 1564, when the Spanish fleet went over to the Philippines. And the Spain then had control of the Philippines from 1564 up until, I think it was 1898, where Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States as part of the end of the Spanish-American War. So this is a view looking over, this is from the hotel, looking over the marina. And here in the background is the large area for the anchorage. Coming out of there, it's a fairly narrow channel, so that one had to watch the tide and the navigation to come out of that particular lagoon. But it was a good hurricane hole where people would spend weeks and months there, depending upon what their procedure or schedules were.
Yes. A lot of the lagoon was 6-8 feet deep, but about half of it was about 2.5 feet deep. So you had to be cautious.
Okay, so we then went from, David and I went from Barra de Navidad up, we passed Puerto Vallarta, and we went up to Manitoulin. These W's here are indicating spots where David and I had a beautiful display of whales. And we would see a big splash like this and wonder what it was. And it was even bigger. And here we found whales were actually broaching the surface and creating gigantic splashes as they did their aerial acrobats. So it was, we had several days of watching these whales perform for us. In Mazatlan, we stayed at Hotel El Cid. And when you're in the marina there, you then have access to all the facilities in the hotel. And so this was one of their poolside areas that we enjoyed. And these are the kind of small electric carts that they use to go between the hotel and different places in town, or we could catch the local bus to go into town as well. Incidentally, this area called Mazatlan was recently in the news because the cartels were unhappy and started shooting up the airport. And many of the tourists who were down in Mazatlan had to forestall their flights back to Canada because the airport was closed because of cartel violence. However, that has been taken care of now, and we had no problems when we were over there. Another interesting aspect is it that this vegetable truck would come around once or twice a week, and we would go with our dinghy across, and we would be able to obtain fresh vegetable from this truck. Just a nice way of accommodating the cruisers that were in the area. Now, we left Mazatlan and we were heading up to Topolobampo. But when we were going up Mazatlan, we then started coming into very heavy weather. And after a half day around midnight, I remember when we were exchanging the watch, our speed was down to only 2 or 3 knots. We still had a long way to go. And the weather forecast was, force 8 winds on the nose. And we were pounding into it quite badly. So we decided to change our minds, and we went back, sailed back to Mazatlan, and spent another couple of days in Mazatlan before taking off. Fortunately, when we went back to Mazatlan, we were able to refuel, and I got extra liters of oil for the boat. And I think I also got a couple more belts just in case. I always like to have a redundancy so that if anything happens, we've got the spare parts. And that proved quite fortuitous to us, because when we then left Mazatlan heading up to Topo, we were actually going to go beyond Topo. We had fairly good conditions, except we noticed that the engine warning light was flickering. And when we checked, we found that the oil level was down, and somehow or other, we were losing oil. We initially planned to go beyond Topo, but when we got up here beyond Topo, the engine blew again. Our belts were shattered, and when we looked in, there was oil all over the place. And somehow or other, we were leaking oil. We didn't know what its source was, but there was oil all over the engine compartment and all over the pulleys and that. So when we finally pulled them apart and put the belts back on, we knew we were still leaking oil badly. And so we didn't want to use the engine because the oil would drain out of the engine just when we turned it on. So we put out a call for any assistance. And we actually had a cruiser who was over here on the Baja Peninsula contacted us and said, yes, we hear your problems. We suggest you go back to Topo and call the marina from Topo when you get there. But if you're going to be there at night, here is a good anchorage that you can settle in, and then call them, and they will then tow you in the next day. So we then sailed from here back into Topo, and we went around and we anchored in Bahia San Ignacio. And so we went in and we dropped the anchor here under sail power only, because we didn't want to use the engine. And then the next day we tried phoning or using the VHF, and we had no response whatever. We called every 15 minutes or half hour from 9 o'clock in the morning until almost noon hour, and no response. And so the question is, what do? We didn't have enough wind at that point in time to try to sail, and we didn't want to risk sailing into Topo under sail only, especially if no one was going to come out and help us. And nobody was responding whatever to our VHF calls on any channels. We didn't put out a distress call, but we put out a call for assistance and no one was responding. So the question is, what do we do? Well, we knew that the engine would work, but it was leaking oil badly. And so what we did is that we said, okay, well, let's use the engine, but let's catch the oil that we're leaking. And so we put this steel bowl underneath the engine. And when the engine was running, oil was leaking out of the engine and we were catching it into this steel bowl. And then after 20 minutes or a half hour, we would shut the engine off and then we would decant the oil from this boat back into the engine, unfiltered, but that way we at least kept the engine with a sufficient amount of oil in it that it would operate. And so we used that system to get us into towboat. The mechanic there then found that what was happening is that a couple of seals on the main engine were shattered, and that's why the engine was leaking oil so badly. So that we spent several days there, good mechanic, and I actually went into Las Mochas with him to get the seals and also to replace the amount of oil that we had used. And unfortunately, at that point in time, Dave Weston, that was with me, had a phone call from his wife, and she was quite concerned about some problems that they were having with a kind of disease that was spreading, and she was afraid that they might start closing down the borders. So David said, well, I've got to leave. And so he left me in Topo and went home to be with his wife. Now, this is about the 4th or 5th of March of 2020.
Mm.
So anyway, I was then down in Topo by myself. Judy had come from Toronto, flew down to Phoenix, rented a car there, and was prepared to meet me up in this place called Puerto Penasco, where we were going to take the boat out of the water and ship it to Chicago. So I contacted Judy, and she reluctantly said, okay, I'll come down. And so she caught a bus from Puerto Penasco in Mexico, a couple hundred miles down to Las Mochas. And from Las Mochas, she then caught a taxi out to Topolobampo. I mentioned this Las Mochas because this was another place that featured just a couple of weeks ago because of some of the cartels shooting up the areas. And Las Mochas and Mazatlan were two areas where the cartels were creating havoc. However, we had no great problems with that. When we decided to leave, we did a staged departure. There was another boat called Harmony, who had a good VHF and single sideband radio. I was able to get weather forecast. And so he identified the weather was supposed to settle down the next day. So what we did is that we then went out and we anchored behind Bahia San Ignacio overnight. And then the next day when the weather settled down, we then took off. Harmony did the same thing, except they decided to go out a bit farther. And when we were in contact with Harmony the next day, they said, oh, it was too rough out there, so they took off earlier. So we didn't see them beyond that point in time. And so Judy and I were then on our way up to, from Topolobampo up to Puerto Penasco. And that was about a 450-mile run. But we had good weather, good conditions. And so we made that run straight through, no stopping, whatever. And it worked out quite nicely for us. And in fact, we enjoyed a couple of days where we were serenaded by some dolphins. These are Judy's favorite animals. Judy would go up to the bow and start clapping them and saying how beautiful they were. They would come around and play around the bow of the boat. Any comments, Judy?
No, it's just, I mean, even on our first Atlantic crossing, when I was horribly seasick the whole way, the dolphins and the whales made it almost worthwhile when I was at my worst. And when I was better than my worst, they did make it worthwhile. The reason that I wasn't along for most of this trip was that I found that I was extremely anxious at the prospect of going out. Anytime the wind picked up when we were prepping the boat, I became very, very stressed. And I realized that this was not, if it's not fun anymore, I don't want to do it. So I was a bit anxious about this passage, except that I needed to be there because there was nobody else to help Aubrey. And the dolphins helped out a lot.
Yeah, it was almost as if Judy had a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome, that she could become very anxious in any kind of heavy weather. But anyway, when we got up there, Murphy's Law, we were making it there at nighttime. And so rather than try to do a nighttime entry, we anchored off Playa Mirador overnight. And then the next morning we went up and into Puerto Penasco. This is the aerial photograph of it. And in low tide, there is a very narrow channel going in with sandbars on both sides. So we were glad we didn't try a nighttime entry into that.
Tide, it's very narrow. It's just that you don't see the sandbanks. They're still there and too shallow to sail over.
So anyway, we went into, and we weren't quite sure. We knew that the marina was at the north end. So we found an opening here, and we went alongside, and sure enough, we were right in front of the Cabrales boatyard. We called them up and they said, yeah, wait until the tide goes up, and then they were going to launch this boat, and then they would take Valeda and bring it on board their own travel lift. So this was now, I think it was about the 9th or 10th of March 2020. And we were hoping that the boat would, we took the boat out of the water, and we were hoping that they would then transport the boat in a month or two up to Chicago. So we were anticipating bring the boat out in March, have it shipped to Chicago sometime in May, and then we would sail it from May up to the North Channel where we lived. Those were the plans at that point in time. And so the idea was to ship it from Puerto Penasco over to Chicago in May of 2020. And then we would go down and we would sail it from Chicago up to the North Channel, because we are now living in Lake Huron on the north shore of Lake Huron. Those were the plans. But of course, that was on the 12th of March.
Yeah, we flew back on March 12th, and the border closed on March 13th.
That was when the pandemic was declared. We had no knowledge of this, other than
we knew there was something, but we didn't know what was going to, as no more did anyone else know what was going to happen or how severe it would be.
So that as a result of the borders closing down, Valeda was landlocked on the hard in Puerto Penasco for 2.5 years before we were able to have it shipped up to Chicago. And we arranged and we had it shipped up in September of last year. And Aaron and Judy and I went down and got the boat ready, and we then sailed it from Chicago up to Lake Huron. So here's Judy. This is our boat, a nicely set up for the boat. This is the inside. But when we got down there after 2.5 years, this is what the inside was like. And it was a mess. Dust all over. The people who were at Cabrales boatyard did not take care of it at all. They did a bit of work. For example, they took out our batteries and they just left everything all over the place. So it was quite a mess that we had to face when we returned to Valeda after 2.5 years unattended on the hard. When they shipped the boat, they actually removed, the Cabrales boatyard in Mexico removed our stern pulpit because they manhandled the mast and they left the mast just on the deck. They did not make a cradle for the mast. I was quite unhappy with the service that we had. And so here was the stern pulpit that was just swung around. Also on the stern pulpit was our GPS antenna, which they then had to remove. And we then found when we tried to reconnect it, the GPS was no longer functional. So we were quite unhappy with the service that was given to us by the boatyard. We had paid for it in advance, a fair sum. And there were just so many things wrong with it, including the fact that the outboard motor that was with it was no longer there. And they have made no attempt to tell us what happened with that outboard motor. And so it was a loss, as well as many other problems. So I was very, very unhappy with the service that we had from the Mexican boatyard. Crowley's boatyard in Chicago did an extremely good job in helping us get Valeta ready. And it took took a lot of time and a lot of money to get it operational. We actually wound up spending more money to have the boat shipped and repaired and operational to sail it up than the boat was actually worth. It would have been better if we could have sold the boat, but after 2.5 years down there was no way that anybody would buy that boat. And it was either walk away from it and use the money to buy a new boat up here or ship it up. So we had it shipped up. So here we are going through the Calumet River, getting ready to go out into Lake Michigan. Here's that bridge behind us as we're sailing. Incidentally, the bimini that we had to be destroyed because it could not, of course, stay there. And it was a fiberglass bimini. And so that has been totally removed, and we're going to have to replace the bimini sometime next summer. So here we are getting ready to go out, but we had a bad weather forecast. So rather than going right out into Lake Michigan, we went around the corner to the Hammond Marina, and we spent a few days there waiting for good weather. Once the weather did settle down, we then had a trip from the southern part of Chicago, and we were planning to go up to the entire length of Lake Michigan. However, when we got up here off Sheboygan, we knew that there was a bad weather forecast. And so the question was, do we go into Sheboygan or do we continue on a little bit and then go into Algoma? We also noticed that on this trip up that our water tanks were empty and we couldn't figure out how come. And we looked in our bilge and our bilge was full of water. Okay, there's a problem. And so we decided, rather than trying to go straight through, let's stop in here. We stopped in a place called Algoma, which is a nice, pleasant, small town. And we spent 2 or 3 days, 3 days there, I guess. And we checked out. And what we found out with our water system was that the hoses going into our hot water tank were badly leaking. And as a result, they emptied our water tanks. So we had to fix that up and get those taken care of.
Yeah. Much better, mind you, if the bilge is going to be full of water, I'd much rather find out that the problem is that the water tank has emptied into it than that outside water is coming in. Given the choice, that's the way I'd rather go. So anyway, we got it fixed.
We checked that out. And Algoma was a nice place, except it was the most expensive marina that we have ever been in. The cost was $3 US a foot per night, plus whatever taxes. So we were paying over $100 a night US for 3 nights to stay in Algoma. Very expensive. However, once we left Algoma, we had a good weather window and we started heading up Lake Michigan. However, we got up to this northern tip and more engine problems. We blew a belt. Well, we only had 1 belt left. And so the discussion was, well, will that last us or should we try to seek shelter? And again, shelter up here was non-existent. We'd either have to go back to Algoma or across over here. There was nothing on this coastline at all that we could use for shelter. However, Judy was quite confident that it would hold.
We had 1 belt that was the right size, and several belts that were just a little bit too small, but I knew that I could, if I took off the drive pulley, I could get them on and then put the drive pulley back on. It's not the ideal, but it works. So there was a backup.
So we decided to carry on. Now, the other problem was that we didn't have our ship's GPS operational. However, Judy had found that we had a GPS on our smartphone. And Judy, will you describe what
Yeah.
you did here?
Well, when I did my really neat jury rig for a mount for the GPS antenna, because it had been on our Bimini and now we didn't have a Bimini anymore, did this really nice mount that I figured out, and then the blasted thing wouldn't work at all. I started to look into replacement GPSs, and I found that seemingly you can either get a handheld GPS or you can get a several $1,000 chart plotter, but there doesn't seem to be anything available in between those. Thought about a handheld GPS, and then I realized I had one on my phone. All I had to do was figure out a way of making it marine. So there is an app called iBoating, and you buy the app for a relatively nominal sum, $50, $60. And I think I had to buy a couple of charts, again, in the $40 range, but that was the whole of the Great Lakes. And then the phone would work as a GPS, and I was able to figure out how to put in a route and how to have the boat follow the route and be able to see where it was. The only thing we had to do was keep the phone plugged in, because it's a bit of a power hog, so you can't just have the phone not plugged in and leave the thing running. But we were able to run it off a 12-volt socket on the boat. So that worked just fine, including being our GPS for going through False Detour Passage up into the North Channel at night. And this particular passage has no nav lights, only cottage lights, but it was an easier passage to do. And I was the one on watch for it, so that was fine. So this is the system showing on my phone, showing our routing. So it's a very handy backup. If anybody realizes they need something, I can recommend it. I do not understand the system. I only managed to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there must be more information about it available. I just haven't researched it further.
So the very handy marine GPS. So this is just a picture of Judy's smartphone with the chartlet. And again, those areas can be magnified, and it gives all the depths and all the chart options that are there. So it's very good. It didn't, I don't know if it ever had anything for tides and currents if you're on the ocean.
I believe
But
it's
for the Great
supposed to,
Lakes.
but I didn't check.
So that it was a very handy thing. And Judy is a very good navigator. In fact, I complain that she navigates the boat like a Queen Mary. She wants to make sure that we are well clear of any obstruction. So this is the chart as we went under the Mackinac Bridge and up through over towards where we were going. Now, again, in the Great Lakes, these are the kind of ships that you find on the Great Lakes. This is a self-unloading bulk carrier that is characteristic of the Great Lakes ships. And here's a picture of us going under the Mackinac Bridge. And the boat, we finally got it up to, and so boat is now on the hard at our North Channel Yacht Club in Sprague. Sprague is halfway between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie on the north shore of Lake Huron. And this is a self-help club where we do all the work ourselves, very economical, but it's right in the heart of the North Channel. And the North Channel is one of the best cruising areas in the world, because there are just so many good anchorages around, fresh water, nice, comfortable small towns with marinas, or lots of isolation if you like being in isolated areas. And especially areas such as the Benjamin Islands are a very valuable area. And so this is where we came through from the Mackinac up through False Detour Passage, and we made our landfall at Blind River where we checked in with Canadian Customs, and they accepted us over the phone, gave us our number. And so we then went from Blind River to our final location at the North Channel Yacht Club. This here is called the North Channel. And you can see from the number of bays and islands that there are fantastic anchorages, and one anchorage to the next is only a couple of hours sail. And so this is a great favorite for especially Americans. During the summertime, the American boats up here are swamp the area. But this is one of the reasons why we decided to settle in Elliott Lake and have our boat in the North Channel Yacht Club, because we can just play around in this lovely Valhalla of the North Channel. So that our boat is now up there, and we're looking forward to spending time on it, playing around this summer. But you're going to see that our go home was fraught with problems, but we finally made it go home. So we're open now to questions or comments.
What was the term staged anchor?
Oh, a staged anchorage, a staged departure is the aspect that when you leave the spot you've been in for whatever length of time and go to a location a little bit out from it, part ways along the route, that's a simpler place to leave. It's the aspect of you leave the complicated bit where you're following a tight channel and go out to an anchorage where when you leave from it, it's simple and straightforward. It's also the aspect of you leave the port where there are a whole lot of people who you have to talk. Oh, I just need to speak to one more person. I need to do another grocery run. And you go out, you finish all that stuff, and then you go out, and then you do the departure directly from a spot.
Oh, interesting. On Google, there's also a use of staged anchor on stage, where you make a place for yourself on a presentation stage.
No, that wasn't our meaning. It was that you do it in stages. Yeah. Stage one is you leave from where you were, and you go to the spot that's easy to get away from.
Steps.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? If not, Juanita had a question in chat. Do you want to bring up that question?
Sure. You were talking about eating the fish. They would bring out the fish in El Salvador for you to choose. Was there any problem with ciguatera down there?
The fish, if there was, we didn't know about it. It tended not to be it wasn't barracuda. You know, they weren't bringing out those sorts of fish. It was normal eating type fish.
Okay.
But as with there wasn't a lot of coral in that area. On the Pacific coast, there's not a lot of coral unless once you're out of the Sea of Cortez. So I suspect that there's not a lot of ciguatera, but I couldn't say for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Anybody else have a comment or question? Please raise your virtual hand in Zoom. Go ahead, Jim, again.
You're muted, Jim.
Thank you. Could you summarize why you had so much trouble with the motor belt?
Yes. I installed the new alternator. I am not a marine mechanic. I'm our best approximation of a marine mechanic. I thought I had everything properly aligned. It wasn't quite. So the drive pulleys were not properly aligned. They looked to be properly aligned, but they were just a little bit off. So there was wear on the belts.
And we didn't identify this until after the second mechanic looked at it, and then we got that
Yeah.
reasonably cleaned up.
Yeah, it was the aspect that they were almost aligned. It wasn't obviously out of alignment, but it was enough that after a little while they wore.
One of the interesting complications was that when we bought that engine, it was a new engine in 2010 or 2011. We changed it because it came with a 55 amp alternator, and we wanted a more powerful alternator. So we switched and put a 100 amp alternator on it. The interesting complication is that the pulley size of the 100 amp alternator was a bit different. And so it just created all kinds of problems getting the right size pulley for the 100 amp alternator
The right size belts.
when it right
Yeah.
size belt when it was designed for a 55 amp alternator. So that in retrospect, I wish we had not made that
Well-
change and we had stuck with the original 55 amp alternator.
Simpler, it's okay. Aubrey's major Christmas present from me, well, there's two of them. There's a bunch of promissory notes for work on the boat, but the other one is a set of 6 alternator belts, the size that actually fits the alternator we've got.
Yeah,
Okay.
a romantic Christmas gift for her.
Okay, okay. Next up is Janet or Jock. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's me. So we keep our boat in Midland now, so we're sailing Georgian Bay and North Channel. When we went up there, we realized that we really have to be using our chart plotter, unlike when we were sailing on Lake Ontario so much. But now I don't know iBoat, but we are using almost exclusively Navionics now on our iPads and our iPhones. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's so much better than the chart plotter, which you can't see as well. A visibility, you have to kind of bend down. We mount our iPad right in front of our face, and it shows us everything we need. It's absolutely phenomenal.
Also, I just wanted, you mentioned about tides, and Navionics in relevant areas does provide tidal current information as well, or tide levels as well as tidal current information. So it's really
Handy.
nice in that respect.
Yeah, our Garmin did, but it's no longer operational. So we have to figure out what we're doing. That's one of the things we'll be doing at the boat show.
Yeah, it would be nice if we could get our Garmin replaced or repaired rather than having to buy something new.
We can't.
Because now the new ones are all large chart plotters.
Okay, next up is Noel. Go ahead.
Hello, no, it's Sally. Yes, I can agree with Jacques and Janet. Navionics on multiple tablets gives us multiple backups. My question to you both is, will you be replacing your Bimini with another hard one? And if you are, will you incorporate solar into that construction?
Okay, we had solar on our original hard Bimini, but our plans are this summer, we are going to have a soft Bimini made. We just don't have the energy to go out and build a new hard Bimini. So we're going to opt the other way and go for a soft Dodger Bimini setup. And we will try to set it up so that we can still have our solar panels mounted on top. I'm not quite sure how we'll work it yet, but that is a priority for us.
Okay, thank you. Julia, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
What an interesting journey. And obviously necessity is the mother of invention. So well done, both of you.
Yes.
My gosh, that was my dad saying, if you can't fix it, you have to then invent it, right? I've seen people on stilts over water off the Malayan coast, fishing villages, and the life on those villages is very austere, and they take people on tourism walks along there to have a look into their building. I thought that was awful for the people living there, but it was a way of income. And then, of course, they had restaurants. Palapas in Mexico, they built me one in one of the botanical gardens, and the fact of fresh fish straight out of the ocean is like nothing else, right? My question is, when I had an RV and we traveled all over the States, we had a home park, but we also had a system called Coast to Coast, and you could stay in any of the parks that were linked to that same system at a set rate, and you would get all the stuff that you needed, you know, food and water and all the rest of it as an extra, of course. But I wondered if there was an oceanic coast to coast type of system that you buy into, besides having a Garmin and just willy-nilly, you know, hope to God that you get there, or a CAA for oceans. I may be very green, but that seems like to be a possible solution. Maybe someone should invent it.
I'm not aware of anything like, I mean, there are assist things depending on where you are. If you're in the US, you get a membership with Boat US and you can get towing. If you don't have a membership, it costs you a great deal more if you need it. But places like Mexico or El Salvador or Guatemala, they just don't have the infrastructure.
Right. Yeah. I knew there must be something. I mean, the fact that you had to pay by the foot or the inch of the length of your vessel seemed horrendous.
Oh, in marina, that's standard in marinas. You're paying there's a rate per foot, which is sensible because people with bigger boats occupy more space and pay more. It's just that $3 a foot seemed a bit extreme.
Yes, and most we thought an expensive one was $1.50 a foot. And
Well,
so
that's because we're older and cheaper. $2 a foot is sort of a not exceptional one, but $3 a foot seemed a bit much.
Anyway, thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot. You got into lots of spots, I guess, of trouble spots. But I'm amazed that you didn't have the right size
belts. Oh, we did. We ran out of them. When you break,
okay. Now, were they breaking because you were in salt water?
No, they were breaking because I didn't have it aligned properly. But I didn't know that I didn't have it aligned properly. It's
okay, so
if
there are
it's
courses.
not quite in line, there's extra friction.
I guess there are courses to teach people how to do that, right?
Yes, I took them. I just didn't learn quite enough.
I understand entirely. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jim, you have another question. Go ahead.
How does one align the pulleys?
With a great deal of caution. There are tools that can be used, straight edges to line them up and get them dead on. I don't have that. I was doing it by tying a piece of string around tightly to get the placement of the brackets, but then you have to take that off and loosen everything off when you're putting the belt on, and then tighten it up, and you torque it just a little bit at a different angle, and then it's not perfectly aligned. Mechanics know how to do it right. I know how to do it almost right. I can't really answer the question.
Okay, I came across a laser for waterline alignment that painters and all use from Home Depot kind of place. And I was wondering if that would be a useful tool to align
It probably would. It probably would be very, very useful. Again, one of my problems with doing these things is that I'm usually doing them somewhere else with very limited access to supplies and parts.
Right.
It's in the aspect of sometimes when we do these talks, people say, well, why did you get such and such particular brand? And the answer is invariably, that's what was available where we were when we needed it. It's not that I get to pick and choose. I'm limited to what I've got available.
Your talk was such a learning experience. I hope you write this up in the style of your giving your courses to Canadian Sail and Power. I mean, when things go wrong, they're learning exercises. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Liz, go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, Judith, Judith and Aubrey, great to see you again. I've seen many of your presentations, even through Toronto Power and Sail, and you always are very explicit with details, interesting stories, interesting problem solving. And I also want to compliment your crew, Aaron, for his contribution today. Just well done and welcome home.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Janet or Jock, go ahead.
Thank you.
Just a quick note about solar panels. We put solar panels on our bimini and on our soft bimini. So we got the semi-flexible ones. We didn't really want to be sewing through our bimini. We didn't think that would look very nice. We didn't want to cut holes to it for attaching the solar panels. So we're using rare earth magnets and attaching it that way. And it's worked extremely well. They're super, super strong. We haven't had any problems with with it coming off or anything.
Oh,
Interesting. Thank
magnet
you.
underneath it.
We haven't decided yet. Part of it is that I really didn't want, I decided I would rather spend money than 3 weeks labor to construct another hard bimini. It's pure laziness on my part. I've got other stuff I'd rather do. And given that we're not going to be living on the boat anymore, and we're not going to be going long distances, it's going to be shorter cruises. The necessity to have the hard bimini and the rigid solar panels we have. I mean, I'm not sure our solar panels, which again have been sitting for 2.5 years untended. The hard ones we have may or may not still be usable. We're going to have to figure all of this out. So we don't really know what we're going to be doing, except that I strongly pushed for pay somebody else to make a soft Dodger and bimini rather than us doing the labor to make a new hard one. We've done it 3 times and I'm tired of it.
If we were closer, for example, in Toronto, I would love to have a hard Dodger and a hard bimini, but I would have to have somebody who could make it. Up here in Northern Ontario, we do not have that option. And so we found a canvas place in Lake Huron on Manitoulin Island that will be able to make the soft Dodger and bimini. And so we will go with that. As I say, if I were down in the Toronto area, I would be looking for somebody who had some skills in fiberglassing and see if we could custom make a Dodger bimini of fiberglass. But again, because of Northern Ontario, we don't have that option. So we have to go with what we can access.
Okay, Michael, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering on your trip whether you ever had any problems with the Mexican customs. And the reason I ask is a number of years ago, I've sailed down the Yucatan Peninsula, and every customs place we stopped into, we had to be bribed by, had to give them something or other. And even at one time when they stole our dinghy and we had to pay salvage to get it back. So I was wondering how the Mexican customs officer treated you.
We had absolutely no problems that way in any of the places we've been. The closest we came to having a problem with the fish, when one of the times we were in Cuba, one person was kind of pushing to get some gifts, and we worked very hard at not understanding him, and eventually he gave up. We did not run into any difficulties that way with officialdom anywhere. Either we're very lucky or we're very naive. I don't know which.
Well, that's good news.
Okay,
Glad they've improved.
George, go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
I really enjoyed your talk as usual. I was just going to make a comment about the people in Algoma on Lake Michigan, probably landlubbers figuring that foreigners with boats are oligarchs and can pay anything they care to charge.
Well, I think that was actually their standard rate. I think it may have been the aspect of scarcity. You know, there's not a lot of other choices nearby, so they could charge what the market would bear. I don't really know.
Okay. We'll take Juanita, and then we'll take a couple more questions before turning it back to Diane to wrap it up. Go ahead, Juanita.
Was just wondering, it was a lovely presentation and very, very interesting. Don't think we've had many talks about the West Coast at all. Anyways, just wondering, now that you're up in the Great Lakes, whether you'll be doing Green Bay.
We haven't gotten farther in our planning than we're going to be cruising the Great Lakes. I'm still feeling stressed at passages. Even I hope I will feel less stressed at passages in the lakes, but I've got other stuff that I'm enjoying doing, and I don't really want to spend my entire summer out on the boat. Aubrey might like to, but I don't know that I'm going to. So we haven't planned anything yet.
Yeah, I expect to be doing a lot of single-handed running around on Volata, because that's my hobby. Judy is very heavily involved now with quilting, and that keeps her occupied quite a bit.
That and our other major activity is driving people back and forth from Elliott Lake to either Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie for medical appointments. There's a set of volunteers who are doing this in Elliott Lake. Unfortunately, it's a rather small set. So I'm getting called for 3-4 trips a week to drive somebody to a medical appointment, for which I get the Northern Travel Grant, which covers my expenses, gas and depreciation, and doesn't do anything for time, which is one of the reasons there aren't a lot of volunteers, but there are a lot of people who need it. So that's what I do I spend a lot of my time doing.
We're all retired, so time is cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I've got a chart of Green Bay down in my bathroom up on the wall that I sit and I look at. But it has Loran overlays, so it's a fair age.
It's showing its age. We haven't actually ever been into Green Bay. We've sailed Lake Michigan before. I mean, that's how we left the Great Lakes, was going down to Chicago and through into the Illinois. But we didn't actually go into Green Bay. So certainly wouldn't rule it out, but we haven't gotten as far as that in terms of planning anything.
It does look a little
This summer is going to mostly be getting Volata refurbished and ready to go, and then we'll see what we do.
Okay. One more question from anyone before we turn it back to Diane.
Sally has written something in the
Hi,
chat.
Bob.
Okay. Okay, then we'll turn it back to Diane. Go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Well, of course, it's amazing what you've done, and congratulations. People have asked you before, probably. I'm much older than you are, but how old are you now?
Aubrey, how old are you now?
Oh, I'll be 85 this summer. 85.
Congratulations. That's amazing that you're doing what you're doing. Wow.
Well, that's why I'm looking forward to, I don't know how many summers I've got, so that we want to just enjoy Volata now that we've got her back here.
Well, you can, absolutely. And I encourage that 100%. I do want to thank you again for agreeing to speak with us today. You've brought probably anticipation to a lot of people who might like to get out there and do some of what you've been doing, if not actually, at least vicariously. And with that, I just wanted to, I did ask Aubrey and Judith earlier if they would come back and do a presentation that they've done before, which was going from the Mississippi to the Black Sea. And it was done in 2017. So we're 6 years ago when you did it, and the political situation has changed in that area. They have agreed. I'm just wondering how many people would be interested in hearing that presentation again. Put your hands up if you are. Okay, well, there we are.
Yeah, that presentation was one of the first ones of our 20-year odyssey. We'll be doing something similar at the boat show on Monday, the 25th, I think it is. We're going to be making two presentations. One is our sailing of the West Coast from Vancouver Island up to Alaska. And then the other one is going to be on our time in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So that if any of you are at the boat show on Monday, I will be making a presentation on those two topics at that time.
And the Monday is definite. The date, we can't remember offhand.
It's the 23rd. It's the 23rd on Monday.
Okay.
Yeah, next Wednesday is the 25th. So I will be in touch with the two of you and we'll find a date that will work.
Okay.
And given where you're located, unless you're planning to be in the city, would probably do it on Zoom again. But
Yeah,
we'll talk
it'll
about
depend.
that. And thank you. That was an absolutely fine presentation. Let's just give them a nice showback round of applause. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Bravo.
Bravo, for sure. For sure.